Hey there friends, Andrea Walford here from Make Beautiful Cards. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this Hey There Friend card featuring Stampin' Up's Autumn Greetings stamp set. Now this card features masking and ink blending. So my first step is to take the largest stamp from the Autumn Greetings stamp set and stamp it onto a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of Whisper White cardstock using my Memento Tuxedo Black ink. Now when you're inking a large stamp, you do want to make sure that you take the time to pat your ink pad all over the surface and just check that the entire stamp is covered with your ink. And again, because the stamp is so large, when you're stamping, you want to make sure you apply pressure everywhere. Now notice that I'm stamping down, lifting up, and if there's any area where I see that the ink didn't transfer, then I'm going back, closing the door, and pressing against it again. So my next step is to die cut my image using my third from my largest die from the stitched rectangle dies. And I'm angling my die in such a way that I'm leaving some white space at the bottom left corner of my frame. Now once I have my frame positioned, I'm die cutting it with my die cutting machine. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my ink blending. So first I'm securing my panel to my grid paper using a little bit of repositionable adhesive, and you can see that I've placed it in a landscape format with that white space at the top left. I'm now taking a piece of stamping mask paper and I'm placing it about 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom edge, and then I'm taking a second piece and I'm placing it a 1/4 inch above that bottom piece. So basically I want to leave a 1/4 inch space of my stamped panel showing. Now using a sponge dauber and my Cajun Craze Classic ink, I'm going to be applying some of that ink to that exposed area. So I'm basically just pouncing, and then with pretty much no pressure on the cardstock, I'm working in a circular motion back and forth across that cardstock piece until I get the depth of color that I want. Now when I removed the top piece of masking paper, so that I could create my orange stripe, I noticed that I accidentally got a little Cajun Craze ink smear there on my cardstock. But because of the position of the ink smear, I was pretty sure that I'd be able to cover it with my greeting, so I decided just to leave it as is. So my next step now is to mask off the area for my pumpkin pie strip. So I took the top piece of masking paper and I moved it up by 1/4 of an inch, and then the bottom piece of masking paper, I also moved it up by a little bit less than a 1/4 inch. So basically, although it's hard to see in the video here, the edge of that bottom piece of masking paper is just slightly below the edge of my Cajun Craze ink. And the reason for that is I don't want to accidentally end up with a little bit of white space in between my two sponged colors. Now in the same way that I applied my Cajun Craze ink, I'm applying my pumpkin pie ink. So I'm using a fresh sponge dauber, and then I just sponged the ink in that area until I got it to the depth that I wanted. Now the last ink color stripe that I'm blending on is my Daffodil Delight ink. Once again, I'm moving my top piece of stamping mask paper up a 1/4 inch from that pumpkin pie strip, and then my bottom piece I moved up so that it aligned just below the top edge of that pumpkin pie sponged area. Then once again, using a fresh sponge dauber, I added some of my Daffodil Delight ink. Now you may have noticed with some of the ink colors I needed to apply a few more layers than I did with others, so it's totally going to depend on what ink colors you're using. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I want to create my greeting. So my greeting is going to be in 2 parts, and for the first part I'm using my Playful Alphabet dies, and I want to die cut the word Hey. So I've gone ahead and cut some pieces of cardstock in Pumpkin Pie, Cajun Craze, and Crushed Curry. And my little cardstock rectangle pieces are a little over an inch high by about 3/4 of an inch wide. Now I'm placing them onto some of my double-sided foam adhesive, and then I'm just cutting it away from the foam adhesive, as you can see there. And then what I'm doing is I'm taking one of each of my dies and then centering it onto the different cardstock pieces. So I'm die cutting the H out of the Cajun Craze, the E out of Pumpkin Pie, and the Y out of Crushed Curry cardstock. So now for the second part of my greeting, I'm using the Hello There Friend from the Autumn Greetings stamp set, and I'm stamping it onto a scrap piece of Whisper White cardstock. Then what I want to do is I want to cut out the there and friend, omitting the hello. So I'm just using my paper snips and I'm fussy cutting around that portion of the greeting, leaving about a 1/16 of an inch border. So now I'm taking the border die from my Autumn Essentials die and a piece of Cajun Craze cardstock. Now you just want to make sure the Cajun Craze cardstock is longer than 4¼ inches. I've aligned the die with the edge of that cardstock piece and then I'm die cutting it with my die cutting machine. Now my next step is to trim it into a 1-inch wide strip. And then with the border positioned to the left, I'm applying some adhesive on top of that Cajun Craze cardstock piece and I'm sticking it to the back of the left edge of my stitched rectangular panel. Now the panel itself is 3 by 4¼ inches, so I'm just using my paper trimmer to trim off any overhanging edge of that Cajun Craze cardstock strip that I stuck to the back of the panel. My next step now is to stick my letters that I die cut for the word hey, and I'm positioning them so that they're about 1/2 inch in from the left edge of my stitched rectangular panel and about 5/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge of that panel because I want to make sure I leave enough room there at the bottom for the second part of my greeting. Now the position of my letters perfectly allows me to hide that little ink smear that I ended up with on my cardstock panel, as you'll remember when I was removing that masking paper. So I'm just removing the backing from my die cut letters and sticking it down to my panel using my grid ruler as a guide to help me make sure I stick them down straight. And I'm positioning my letters so that there's about a 1/16 of an inch in between each letter. Now for the second part of the greeting, the there friend, I'm placing some of my mini Stampin' dimensionals along the back because I want to pop it up. Now because the height of that greeting is very small or very narrow, I have to cut a few pieces of Stampin' dimensional to fit on the back because the full dimensionals themselves are a little bit too big. So after removing the backing from my Stampin' dimensionals, I'm sticking my greeting down to my cardstock panel. Now I'm ready to stick this onto the front of my card, and for that I'm going to be using some Stampin' dimensionals as well. Now after removing the backing from my Stampin' dimensionals, I centered and stuck my panel onto my card front, and my card is a standard 4¼ by 5½ inch card created out of Whisper White thick cardstock. Now my final step for my card is to embellish with a few rhinestones, and I'm using my champagne rhinestone jewels and I'm just clustering them around the greeting. So a few at the right, at the top, and one at the bottom. Well, there you have it, friends. Our card is now finished. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial and I look forward to creating with you again soon. See ya!